The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast. Critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Now, here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Very, very excited today to record our 100th episode on the FlightBridgeED Podcast. I've got my great buddy, my best friend, Mike Verkest here. He's going to host the show, and we're going to do a kind of a top five, but we're going to look at the top 5 downloaded podcasts over the last 4 years.
Yeah. How you doing, man?
I'm good, man. Got a little emotional.
Yeah,
thinking of 4 years.
I know, and we're going to talk a lot about kind of the last 4 years a little bit, and kind of how the last 100 episodes, I guess the last 99 episodes have gone, and kind of how FlightBridge has evolved and things like that. So I'm super proud of you, super proud of the product that you put out. And, as we've talked about 100 times, every time we travel somewhere or every email you get, people are just so thankful for the service that you provide them. And so, just on a personal note, buddy, I love you, and I'm super happy for you. And let's get into the show a little bit. So welcome to the 100th episode. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Eric, is where did the podcast come from? I know, and so if you're a longtime listener of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, or if you've listened to Second Shift, kind of the other product we do, some of the stuff might sound familiar to you, but what we're hoping for is that the folks that are listening now, maybe they'll share this podcast with somebody. And so we want to kind of give them kind of from time zero where we're at. So really, this would be aimed at not only thanking our current folks that listen to the podcast on a regular basis, but really, if someone's just brand new and never heard it before, we want to kind of give them the whole story of FlightBridgeED and kind of the podcast and the courses and all the different things that FlightBridge does. So Eric, kind of start from the beginning. Everything kind of started with the podcast, didn't it?
Yeah, so I had started listening to the eMCrit podcast back in 2008, and I think at that time he was maybe a year into doing the podcast, maybe 2 years, and I really, really enjoyed it. I just thought the education was top notch,
yeah.
And just kind of going through my career and being a field training officer on the ground side, and then progressing to that kind of role on the HIM side. I just loved the teaching aspect. I loved the mentoring aspect. But one of the things I saw during that evolution was not everybody had success once they left that orientation process. And I just, I thought, man, there's got to be something else that somebody could do.
Yeah.
And then, flying into these rural areas, I saw from the eMCrit side just all this evidence-based practice.
Yeah.
Stuff that I was learning. And then, you would go to these rural environments and you would see medicine being practiced way out of date. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to do something. I think the initial thought was maybe doing something more on the consulting side.
Yeah.
But then I came up with the idea of starting the podcast. Mm-hmm. And so honestly, Evan, everybody, we talk about Evan all the time. He's the behind the scenes guy.
We'll definitely talk about Evan here as we're coming up.
and so, I stopped by the base and we were talking, and I was just rattling around a name. And I talked about, the flight, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And he came up with a name. So he came up with FlightBridge, and then I added the ED on the end, and that's where the name came from.
Nice.
So that's kind of how that happened. And, went out and got on some YouTube videos and tried to figure out how to record, bought a cheap mic. And so you can go back to the first couple episodes and you can hear a big difference in audio quality.
Sure.
Not really knowing what I was doing. And
were you using 2 cans and a string between them?
Pretty much. I mean, I have the original mic.
Yeah.
And it's like a 1999 Walmart special.
Hey, well, you know what? You at least you got something started, right?
Yeah.
And who cares?
Yeah.
So, what was the topic of your first podcast back in the day?
I believe the first podcast was cellular respiration.
Oh, okay.
I kind of looked at, I wanted to start with a foundation.
Yeah.
And, I wanted to build on those concepts. So I started with cellular respiration, and then I kind of evolved from there.
I love it. So how has the podcast evolved over time? So not so much, I guess I'm not talking about audio equipment and things like that, although there's been quite a jump in, kind of like you were just talking about, from your first, $30 microphone and a dream to kind of where we are today with, professional audio equipment, all that stuff. But I mean, have the topics changed? And if they have, where do you come up with the ideas for your podcasts?
That's a good question. I think the topics, when I got to probably episode 30, I realized I was already running out of topic ideas. You can pretty much do 30 topics and identify concepts based on maybe protocols or, standard things that you see on flights or in transports.
Mm-hmm.
Once I hit that, I started really reading journals, and I had 4 different I guess it's not a prescription, it's a subscription to those different journals. And so I would just read those, and then I found an amazing website called criticalcarereviews.com, and that sends me a weekly newsletter of every new published research anywhere in the world on every different subgroup of medicine. And so I would read those, and that's where I would come up with ideas, kind of that secondary level after I kind of went through the first 20 to 25 different podcast ideas. So, I think there were times where I felt at that point where I started questioning, am I going to be able to continue with good, solid topics? I think that was the big thing, is I didn't want to just put out anything. And I wanted it to be relevant and purposeful for people. And so there were times that I felt like I would be inspired by something.
Yeah.
And I just learned as I went. If I was driving, I did I was with Air Methods at the time. I started with Air Methods pretty much at the same time as the start of FlightBridgeED, and the big growth period of FlightBridgeED, I was working as a float, and I was covering 4 or 5 states.
So you had a lot of driving time.
A lot of drive time. So I was able to reflect and think about things, and I would, if I came up with an idea or a thought, I would always write it down or put it in my phone.
Yeah.
And I learned that was a really important time, was that drive time, to really reflect and think about things.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I'd also, I guess now is just as good a time as ever to maybe talk about social media, the concept of FOAMed, and how that I would say over the last 18 months, maybe 2 years, really probably at the most. It might have always kind of been out there in maybe a smaller circle, smaller groups, but I know for myself, the concept of FOAMed, the free open access medical education, has really changed the way we talk about and the way we deliver kind of our critical care. And even for me, not necessarily on the critical care side, more on the ground side, it's just really changed what we do. And so I'm wondering, how has FOAMed kind of changed the way FlightBridgeED kind of operates? And I guess I'm meaning more from a topical sense, or keeping up on maybe what's the kind of the latest, greatest cutting edge stuff that's going on out there.
Well, I'm not a big Facebook person.
Nope.
And you know that. We do have a business Facebook page that
I manage,
and you you manage that, and
along with Clint.
Clint actually helps manage that as well. And so that's just posting our courses and things related to what we're doing. I think Twitter has been a big thing, and I think the when I really got involved in Twitter was right before the SMAC conference 2 years ago.
So was that Chicago? Yeah.
And I think we only had about 100 followers on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I think right now we're approaching 1,650, I think. And so the growth has been immense on that side of the house, in comparison to other things. And I think Twitter has been the backbone. And so for you listeners out there, if you're really wanting to really get into the FOAMed world and not only just hear what I have to say, but really focus on what's going on around the world. Follow FlightBridgeED, and then start watching the people that are on there. I mean, we have doctors and intensivists and brilliant minds from all over the world that post amazing things. And
Absolutely.
I think that is the whole aspect of really the mission of FlightBridgeED was trying to share information.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my whole goal, was to try to educate our future generation of flight crews, but also disseminate this level 1 research, this high quality research and stuff to these small areas, where a lot of times by the time it actually reaches those areas, we know that research is now really not relevant, right? I mean, we're research is usually, by the time it comes out, it's
a pretty stale. Well, it's just like this. It's like the saying, if you want to know what we did 5 years ago, read a textbook. If you want to know what we're doing now, and if you want to know what we're going to be doing, social media is a good way to do that. And so, but there are some dangers with FOAMed, social media, and things like that too, because I know we've actually talked about it, not only on the FlightBridge podcast, but the Second Shift as well, is people hear the concepts and the things that we talk about, and they believe in it, and they understand the evidence that backs up the stuff we're talking about. And so, but the problem comes in is when they don't have authorization, or they don't have protocols to do that. And so what they try, so it's a sticky wicket that people find themselves getting into occasionally is they'll hear something really cool and cutting edge, and then try to take that back, and they go about trying to implement it the wrong way. And I know we've always talked about, make sure you talk to your medical directors, present them the evidence, have that conversation with them. Don't go John Wayne things and try to, and the perfect example that I dealt with at my agency at the time, this was a couple years ago, was the pain control, pain management in RSI. So it wasn't necessarily in our protocols, and it wasn't, I guess, necessarily against the protocols, but it wasn't listed as something that we should or could do. And we started having people that were listening to the podcast, and they'd be like, "Hey man, I gave fentanyl after RSI." And I'm like, "Well, golly, I mean, that's good, but we are not allowed to do that kind of." But fast forward, guess what's in the protocols now? Fentanyl for pain control, RSI. So things take time. So people have to be kind of careful when they go about, what they listen to, and really try to vet out what is the evidence that the person that's doing a podcast or putting out a FOAMed post, things like that. You just got to be careful.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think you've seen the podcast kind of evolve. I don't really remember what episode that I actually put the disclaimer on the podcast, but it was actually in response to two different providers in the United States that actually, based on the Push Dose Presser podcast,
decided to do
above. Yeah, they decided they were going to, push, do neo pushes, and not a good thing. So I think that's a great point. It's good. Utilize this. Bring this stuff to your medical director. We always publish the research in the show notes. That's something I learned probably after the 15th podcast, that I really needed to always put the information in the podcast, and that's just kind of shows validity, and want people to read those articles and make their own opinions. And,
exactly.
And not just
That's
take my word for it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Is we've had Dr. Sania, we've had multiple medical directors over, the last 4 years. Probably a few more on the Second Shift side than the FlightBridgeED side, but nonetheless, there is a great, and I always have to catch myself because, and we've talked about it before, is not everyone has the same relationship with medical directors as that maybe I do, or that maybe you do. And in fact, that was a hot topic. Maybe if we have time, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I did a poll about, do medical directors make a difference in outcomes and provider skills? And it was pretty overwhelming, but it's to the positive. But there are people out there that have never maybe met their medical director, and so they don't have that relationship to bring them and say, I was listening to a podcast. I have these 2 studies that they talked about. What do you think about how this would look in our system, or something like that? And that's really the best kind of way to go at it from a field perspective. if you're trying to make a change in your protocol. So you just got to be smart. You got to be careful, and there's definitely a right way and a wrong way to do it. So, and we've seen it all.
Yeah. I mean, I hope, that the podcast has provided, good quality education, that it's invested in people's lives. And I think that's obviously the goal, but it also, hopefully it changes our practice, all the way down to the ground level or in the hospital side. If you can bring this stuff to areas that maybe don't know, they're doing things maybe a little behind.
Yep.
And we're only as smart as who we collaborate with. And I say that all the time. If we don't know what we don't know, we can never make a positive, change and move kind of forward. So
yeah. And
hopefully the podcast has done that.
Absolutely. And one thing that I kind of didn't really mention, although I wanted to, was the fact, kind of going back to Twitter for a second, because I wanted to get this in at, me and my ADD or whatever. But where else can you collaborate with? And you kind of hit on it a little bit, but I mean, I have been involved in amazing conversations with providers from all over the world, from Ireland to the UK, Canada, South Africa. I mean, Australia. A lot of people that I interact with are from Australia. You're not going to get that if you're just living in your little town, or even if you're in a big town. You're just not going to get it. I mean, and so, we're in the United States, we're perpetually behind, it seems, at least the folks in Australia. I mean, it's really apples and oranges. So it's not really a fair comparison, because I think there's everything from education up is completely different and better than ours. But I mean, get on Twitter, man, and interact with these people. It's just amazing. It'll enhance your career. It'll enhance your patient care. And it's just phenomenal. So enough about that. So unless you have anything to add, I want to make sure that I give you the last word on some of these things. Okay. So a lot of people think of FlightBridgeED as the podcast. And of course, that was the flagship. That's kind of what attracted people to FlightBridgeED. But a lot of people maybe haven't been to the website. They don't maybe understand the bigger, and it's not necessarily the bigger, but the diversity of the things that you do and the services that you offer. So, looking around the website, there are a lot of things. So why don't you talk a little bit about kind of how your review courses kind of started out, how that's changed, maybe talk about the books a little bit. And so tell us just basically, what is FlightBridgeED?
Well, like you said, FlightBridgeED started out as the podcast, and then about, I would say 7 months in, probably a little bit prior to that, we were, I don't really remember how it started, but for whatever reason, I decided to start providing a review course.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was just based on somebody encouraged me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we, wrote the curriculum, got it approved, went through that whole process, and just started putting it out there. And from the start, we did our first review course in Dallas, Texas, and then we went right from there to Alabama. And then we went back to Texas and did one in Abilene. And so it was, we actually did start off pretty busy. I was pretty excited. And, so basically that was June of 2012. And so from June of 2012 until the end of that year, I think we did 6 review courses a month.
So for the people that are listening and that maybe have never, maybe this is their first time listening. So why would somebody need a review course? What's the purpose of a review course? Why would somebody want to take one, and how does it benefit them?
So a review course is based on the idea of a critical care provider, whether you're a nurse or you're a paramedic, wanting to either get into the flight side and get their FPC or their CFRN, so flight paramedic certification, or their certified flight nurse, or on the ground side, our review course encompasses the same curriculum that you would need for the CCP-C, which is the critical care paramedic certified.
Okay.
And so the content and the tests are very difficult, very, very, very much based on physician level decision making.
Yeah.
And so I think if you don't have any critical care background, there really is a big jump. You don't realize it when you're just working on the ground side, but there is a big jump when you go into the critical care side.
I can vouch for that, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's basically we started out with a 2-day review course. We've evolved that to 2.5 days just based on, trying to allow more time so everybody's not as tired. And, it's evolved. We constantly change the curriculum based on what we're seeing with the tests and the feedback we're getting from students. Obviously, in the initial, I would say, year and a half, we made a lot of changes to the book, to the overall course, the structure, adding more case scenarios, and really taking the time. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned, not only with FlightBridgeED, but in business, is you may have an idea, but you have to listen to your customers.
Well, absolutely.
And even if your idea is, straight and narrow, and everybody else says, no, that doesn't fly, you have to be objective and humble enough to listen and make those changes, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's all about statistics and sample size. And so I really feel like the course is based on now, last year we taught 600 students, 600 people. That's how many courses and students we taught. So that was just in 1 year.
Yeah. I remember,
so that's huge.
I remember when we were driving down the street we had just left EAMTC, and we were talking about kind of the growth kind of year over year and how really, and it's just a credit to you and Ashley and everyone on the team that how many more people are entrusting their careers. I mean, their advancement in their career to FlightBridgeED and to you specifically. And it's just amazing from year one to year 4 or 5 or whatever it is. It was really good. And like I said, I think it's a testament to you guys for putting together a good product, because there's a lot of choices. People can go online if they want and take some, pardon my expression, raggedy, thing. And it checks the box that they did it, but it doesn't enhance their, ability to care for people. And I think that's one of the things that sets you guys apart. That's just my opinion.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think one of the things that I feel sets us apart from any of our competitors is that you have the same instructors every single time.
Yep.
We have taught now over 60 review classes. And so, there are obviously classes that still happen that I'll get asked a question that I haven't ever been asked, but that's very rare. And I feel like I've been asked the same questions, and I've been able to, if I don't know something, I've been able to research that and educate myself. And, I understand the content to a level to where I can speak and articulate things in a way that's dynamic. And so you have consistency.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's a key thing. You have consistency. And then I think we also give the learner multiple ways to learn. You come in, you do the review class, which is 20 hours. You get the books. So you're not having to sit there and take notes the entire time. A lot of the information is already up, there for you. You get the fast exam prep book. And you get a 2-week subscription to our online exams, which really kind of brings everything together. And so we really try to give everybody, the whole package to hit on all the phases of learning.
Yeah. No, it's...
And so I think that's again been an evolutionary process based on where we started and where we are today.
Yeah, and I'll just add kind of my own 2 cents to that, and that is you have, unfortunately, you guys have to turn down classes because the demand is high, but there's only 2 of you, right? And so, again, that's just a testament to you guys and the fact that you want to deliver a quality product. And sure, if you wanted to, you could find some buddies and give them the material and have them go present that, but that's not who you are. That's not FlightBridgeED. And I know you would always rather be the one to teach this stuff. I mean, you or Ashley, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that's not a knock on anybody.
No,
I want people to know that is not a knock on anybody.
Not at all. I think the philosophy is just a little bit different. That's the way I take it. It's not a knock on anybody.
I feel, and I honestly feel now, and it's not something that I purposely had happen, but based on the podcast, the popularity, the amount of downloads we see, the listenership around the world, I almost feel like it's expected. I feel like that is a big reason why, our students come to us is because they've listened to us now for a couple years. And they've built a trust. I've earned their trust. And so I think they come to our course based on that. And I honestly feel like it would upset some people if they came and again, that's just, that is who we are.
Yeah.
I always want to be that flagship person in the front, and I want to make sure things are done perfectly.
Yeah.
And
that's awesome. So the review courses, so books, you have become an author over the last 4 years, and of course, you wouldn't have been able to do it without the help of Ashley. Obviously, we'll talk about the team here in a minute, but talk about your experiences of being an author and maybe some of the perils and pitfalls you've gone through. And did you ever see yourself as being somebody who has written at least 2 Amazon bestsellers? I mean, this is my buddy Eric, and and this is no offense to you, but I was like, this dude's writing amazing stuff, and people are buying it, and it's not just the product, but they're buying into the philosophy and the educational part of it. So talk a little bit about your experiences as being an author.
I think that is something when I reflect back on my education, that's probably the subject that I didn't have the confidence in. And so I think that me being able to even write and have people buy the books, is mind blowing. And I think that is, like you said, that's a testament to Ashley.
Yeah,
so.
No, for sure. And I know you're a humble guy, and I know you're getting choked up right now talking about it because I can see that. And I know you hate talking about it because because you're such a humble, real guy to me. I mean, not just to me, but and not because I've known you for 20 years, but and it's super awkward when people come up to you and want to praise you and thank you for the stuff that you've done for them. And so maybe talk a little bit about, I mean, how does that make you feel? I mean, and does it? I mean, I know how it makes you feel, but do you feel more of a responsibility to the people? Because I feel like you take it so seriously and take it straight to heart that people trust in you to give them good information. And so I guess that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, is they've kind of built a relationship with you. They may have never met you. They might have heard your voice, or they might have read your textbook or your books. So talk a little bit about that. I mean, how does that translate to your everyday life? I mean, how has that changed you as a person?
I think that's obviously something that's uncomfortable. I hope I'm a role model to people. And, I think it's really hard to be in small town Kentucky and know that we have listeners, all over the world. And that, I get emails from, places in the United States just had one the other day from a gentleman in Dubai, another one from Saudi Arabia, and so to know that the reach has gone that widespread and that there's no borders per se.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty neat, and it's not something that I could ever fathomed. And I think, like you said, I just want to always put out relevant, good quality education and let people kind of ponder things in a different way and think about that the responsibility of being a nurse or paramedic or doctor, nurse practitioner, PA, that's a big, big deal. And you have to constantly feed yourself, and give yourself, that fuel to become better providers. And so I think that is, that's kind of what drives me forward and keeps me wanting to put out more and more content. Now we're up to 100th episode. That's a lot of episodes. When you start thinking about it, that's a lot of topics.
Yeah, it is a lot of topics. Yeah.
You just, it makes it more and more difficult to put out good quality stuff. And so I don't ever want us to, be looked at as, the first 4 years was amazing, but now, the content's not as good.
Yeah.
I don't want that.
Yeah.
I want to continue to put out good, solid stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. So I was just looking at the FlightBridgeED.com website, and you're essentially booked out for the entire year. It looks like, at least all the way through October. So you're going to be in Utah, in this month in February. March you'll be in Boston. for a ventilator workshop. March, you're doing a review course in South Dakota. Then you'll be in Ireland. Then you'll be in Vermont, Spokane, Fort Wayne, India, Chico, California, Temple, Texas, Honolulu. Do you need a second shift presence there for that one? We might have to talk a little bit about that one. Then you'll be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Atlanta, Georgia, Hershey, Pennsylvania, Mount Vernon, Illinois. And then finally in October, you'll be in Vegas. So, man, and don't forget, folks, he has an actual full-time job that he does as well. So pretty amazing stuff. All right. We've talked about FlightBridgeED. We've talked about evolution. We talked a little bit about the podcast. So why don't you talk about the folks that you don't ever get that, not you, but the people listening, they don't ever get to hear from. So let's talk about Ashley, Evan. Let's talk about contributors. So tell us a little bit about the folks behind the scenes at FlightBridgeED.
Well, let's start with Evan. He has been kind of the backbone to, everything we've done. He's been a mentor, a close friend, and he's, somebody that I can always call and ask business advice, or he always seems to have that discernment and ability to kind of look at things from a really objective outlook. He's obviously the one that has built every website that we've had. We're on our third
version
website,
3, yeah.
And he's the one that comes up with all the artwork for the podcast and does so many things behind the scenes that is just, I could not have done this without him.
Yeah, he is an amazing guy. I've got to meet him a few times, and he's right where he wants to be, right? I mean, he's got no desire to be on a podcast. He's got no desire to put his face out there. I mean, I think he finally got a Twitter sometime this last year, and I don't know if he's ever been on it or not, but that's just not him. And I think he's super happy behind the scenes and filling that role, and that's okay because we'll take it, right? I mean, he's just an amazing guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And then my wife.
People have heard us talk about Ashley a lot. And by the way, she is phenomenal. She is a spitfire. She is the funniest gal. And her and I get along like peas and carrots. And it's the funniest thing because we both have the same observations of our best friend. And it's just uncanny. She'll text me a picture of this guy. Like, let me give you an example. I know this isn't second shift, but I got to say this. So we're talking the other day, and this dude's at the mall. They're at the mall. And he's talking to me. He's sitting in one of those massage chairs. You guys seen those in the mall? You put your dollar in or whatever, and it squeezes on your legs and all this stuff. And anyway, so he tells me he's in this chair, and we let go. So she sends me a picture of this guy, talking to me on the phone while he's in this chair. And I'm like, who sits in these chairs, right? Like who really does this? Is this like real life? And anyway, so she had this, she's like, I said the same thing, like who sits in these chairs? So for me, our relationship has been awesome. It's been so great to get to know her over the last few years. And most people don't realize that she is a nurse practitioner. She works in various settings. She works in the ED. She does home stuff. She's super involved. But they may not realize is how pivotal she is to the success of FlightBridgeED. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Ashley. Where did you meet her?
Well, I actually met her. Honestly, she was hired when we were both working for a different company. And I was actually her FTO. And so that's how we met. And from the first day I met her, I mean, it was that spitfire came out, that banter back and forth, mm-hmm. and we became best friends, and the rest is history. So we've been together 6 years, and like you said, I could not have done any of this without her. She is so pivotal.
It's all good, brother. It's all good. I think people get the point. So let's change subjects real quick. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about on our 100th episode, or I should say on Eric's FlightBridgeED 100th episode, is the fact that the podcasts have kind of grown and grown and grown and grown. And then and about 2 years ago, we added the Second Shift podcast, which was I actually had came on the FlightBridgeED podcast to actually talk about a TXA study that we were doing. And it got really good reviews, and people gave Eric lots of feedback. God, that guy was funny, and he was, articulate, and you should have him on again, or something like that. I don't remember how it exactly went down. And so we started kind of a second podcast, which was more light. It wasn't. I mean, we still talk about EMS topics. It's obviously an EMS podcast, but it's a little bit more lighter, a little bit more jackassery going on in there, and it's just a chance for him and I just to kind of like hang out. And that was a lot of the feedback we got on the second shift. It was like sitting around the table in the morning after or before the shift started, and just hanging out with the guys and the gals, and just kind of super laid back, and people really seem to like that. And we have continued to do the second shift for a couple of years now. With schedules, it's super hard, and the people that are second shift listeners are tired of me saying that, but trying to coordinate our schedules and around the FlightBridgeED courses and Eric's schedule and my schedule and the time differences, and it has just been super hard the last 6 months to really be on a regular schedule, but we've committed to try to do that the best we can. We're working on some technology things to make it a little bit easier to do that. So if you haven't listened to the second shift, check it out. It's pretty good. You can go onto iTunes and find it there. It's part of the FlightBridgeED Podcast family. And so over the last 90 days, Eric, the FlightBridgeED podcasts, about 52,000 downloads in the last 90 days. Isn't that the information you gave me?
Yeah, I pulled it up and showed you. Yeah,
it's that is something, and I'll tell you what finally, because I mean the numbers seem like there's bajillions of people in the world, right? And clearly they don't all listen to EMS or critical care podcasts. But what got it for me the other day was I was listening to what seemed it was a very professional done podcast. It was great. And I don't even remember the name of it now. It was earlier this week. And the guy that was the host, said, we are up to 200 downloads. And he was so excited. And it was such a big deal. And then I think to myself, almost 53,000 downloads in 90 days. And we were talking before we started recording, Eric, that you remember the time when FlightBridgeED Podcast had 50 downloads, and it was it was the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah, I remember going on there on that first website, and we had, I had put out I think 4 or 5 podcasts, and I remember when you saw 50 downloads,
yeah,
and then 100 downloads, and man, I thought that was just something else. I couldn't. So yeah, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, and again, I know you're a humble guy, and I'm not mentioning these things to make us sound like we're the bee's knees, because that's not the intention. But it's just, again, it's a testament of the quality that you put out, the trust, again, that people have in you and the information you present to them. So it's pretty cool. So on the same vein, what we thought would be great is to kind of take a trip back in time a little bit and talk a little bit about the top 5 most downloaded podcast episodes from the FlightBridgeED Podcast. And surprisingly enough, we had a second shift podcast that was in the top 5 of all time. If you look at all the FlightBridgeED and second shift ones, we actually had one in there, and it was a very important podcast, and we'll get to those in a minute. So, but the first one we're going to talk about was the podcast about the 28-month-old collapse. So it was a child that went down. This podcast had around 8,600 downloads. A single episode had about 8,600 downloads. So what I thought we would do is we would talk a little bit about each of these episodes, kind of maybe discuss why do we think, and I have a hypothesis about looking at the list, and I think maybe when we get done with the list, I'll kind of put my 2 cents in, but I feel that these most top downloaded episodes really reflect the topics that people tend to struggle with in their career as far as education goes. So we'll talk about some pediatric stuff. We'll talk about TBI. We'll talk about some other stuff. But, it's kind of funny, at least if I reflect back to the training that I provide at my agency, and really, I bet you they mirror everybody's agency out there, is these are the ones that are tough. These are the ones that challenge people. And so I thought it was super amazing that these top downloaded ones really kind of match up with that. So let's talk about the first one real quick. This was the 28-month-old that collapsed. And so why don't you talk about the highlights of this case real quick, Eric?
Yeah, so this was a actual, patient flight that was really interesting. And this was a 28-month-old female that got up that morning and started drinking a lot of water. And I guess per the parents, this was very normal for her. She liked to drink water. And then about an hour after drinking about a bottle and a half of water, I'm trying to remember. You can always refer back to the original podcast.
Yeah, and what we're going to try to do is also
lethargic.
We're going to post the link to these podcasts in the show notes. So just the show notes again, you got to go to the FlightBridgeED website and then go to podcast, and then you will find links, and all the things that we're going to talk about will be put there. So I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to make sure people knew that.
No, that's cool. And so this patient was transported by EMS to a local facility. Based on about an hour after she drank all this water, she became very lethargic. She said she had to use the bathroom, so her dad put her on the toilet, and then while she was on the toilet, she went into a grand mal seizure. And so I thought this was very interesting because of the differential diagnosis aspects. One of the things that EMS stated was that they could not get the seizure to break, and they gave the benzos, tried to break it, gave a lot of benzos to the point where the respiratory drive was actually knocked out. And I think that's very normal in a status seizure like that. Just like with any pediatric patient, volume resuscitation is the key. And so they started their IV access. They were able to give their 20 mil per kilo boluses. And shortly before they arrived at the hospital, the patient stopped seizing. So they obviously they weren't aware of the reason why. And when the flight team actually arrived at the facility, they gave the team the labs. And one of the things that stuck out was the sodium was 122. And the patient was extremely acidotic. This was a normal, healthy 28-month-old female, no medical history. And this was after 1 hour of status seizure. And so the pH was 6.89, PO2 was 102, the biocarb was 13, and the CO2 was 20, base deficit of negative 15. So when you look at that, you look at the correction, the CO2 was 102. The CO2 was 102. So this was a mixed disturbance. So I'll say it again, pH of 6.87, PCO2 of 102, bicarb of 13, a PO2 of 425. So, had a lot of dissolved oxygen floating around in the blood and the plasma, and then a base deficit of negative 15. So this was a mixed disturbance. And so we know that mixed disturbance, that is not a normal compensation. And so why do patients have a mixed disturbance? And why was she, after 1 hour, already showing a severe metabolic acidosis?
Yeah.
And so that was actually, something that was interesting. And we have to remember, a status seizure, they're going to be apneic. Their airway is not going to be managed appropriately. Oftentimes it's very difficult to manage an airway like that. And so that's why she was in a mixed disturbance to that level. So when we look at the differential diagnosis on this patient, what is the glucose? The glucose was fine. Glucose was, normal, 102.
And that was, thinking, from the ground side, the 15, 20 minutes we get to spend with people, it's hard to get that full picture. So I'll tell you that right off the bat, that was part of my differential, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. Well, the seizure is a little bit weird, but the history of drinking all the water and doing all the stuff, even though that's quote unquote normal, that was stuck out to me. So
sure. And so when you think about the sugar being normal, why would a healthy 28-month-old just collapse like that? Yeah. I'm always thinking in those types of patients, is this an abuse issue?
Sure.
Is this a traumatic brain injury based on abuse? That just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Obviously, status seizure doesn't really make sense. So always thinking about, does this patient have an undiagnosed brain tumor?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So those are the kind of the two things. And so, if you kind of refer back to this podcast, we talked about cerebral edema, and we talked about the aspects of why would the patient just go into a status seizure like that? Well, we got to think about the sodium was 122 when she arrived at the hospital. And anytime the sodium drops below 120, and that's probably going to be dependent on the patient. Yeah. There's very high likelihood that they're going to seize. And that's exactly what happened. The intensivist at the receiving facility actually said that exact thing, that EMS just giving the fluid boluses with a high concentration of sodium with normal saline. We know that it's 155 milliequivalent. That's probably what raised the sodium up over 120.
And that's why the seizure
stopped the seizure. Yeah. And so I think this was just an isolated issue of dilutional hyponatremia. That's all it was. But we can see such a secondary effects. We had the severe acidosis, the status seizure. What if the patient would have vomited, aspirated, and then we got airway issues, and then the hypercapnia of PCO2 of 102. Yeah. There's a lot of things that we have to manage on these patients. Other differential diagnosis we discussed were, is this a undiagnosed type 1 diabetes with a new onset DKA?
Yep. Yeah, like I said,
obviously,
that was my first thought,
Sure. So we have the severe acidosis. We have excessive thirst, which she had. Ketones. One of the things we have to know about ketones are a byproduct of fatty acid breakdown. And we see that's kind of the differential diagnosis marker in DKA is you're looking for those ketones. Obviously, her sugar was low, so that kind of rules out the DKA aspect. Yeah. But you can also have ketones with a really prolonged seizure activity, especially in a kid like that, because they're going to burn through the glycogen stores. They're going to start breaking down other fatty acids for fuel, and so that's kind of a byproduct of that.
Sure. So the other thing I was thinking, what could have been, maybe it was an overdose of some kind.
Sure. Absolutely. And you bring up that's a great point is Reye's syndrome.
Oh.
And so is this a possible ingestion of aspirin, an aspirin overdose? And so that's kind of one of those differential diagnosis that I honestly probably wouldn't have thought of. Yeah. That's something that just based on my research, preparing for the podcast, I came up with that. Yeah. And when I found that, I want to say that Ashley actually brought that up. Got to give her credit for that. I think she did. She brought that up, and I'm like, I didn't even know the pathophysiology of Reye's. Is it Reye's syndrome or it's Reye's syndrome?
Right. Yeah.
So I think that the key points of this podcast, utilizing that weight-based guide, whether that's Broslow or obviously a lot of places are going with the Hantivy system. Absolutely. Our good buddy, Dr.
Peter Hantivy.
Yep.
Been a guest on the second shift a couple of times, and super good guy. And just real quick, since we're talking about kind of pediatric guides and things like that, there's age based and there's length or weight based guides. And I think it seems like maybe a year ago or so, there was a study that was done that kind of put age versus the length or weight based. And apparently there were fewer errors, which, by the way, there's at NAEMSP the other day, poster presentation talking about pediatric safety, and unfortunately it was a lot of data from my area, and it just showed, and I don't want to misquote, but I want to say, so please don't quote me, it was in the neighborhood of about 68% of our pediatric patients that had a medication administered to them had an error of some kind. Typically it was an underdosing of whatever drug it was. And by the way, we actually use a pediatric guide for all those calls. So just a little shout out there that pay attention to your dosing, whatever you need to do for patient safety, but there's a lot of issues. So get something. I personally love the Hantivy system, and that's just not because he's been on our show, but it makes a lot of sense to me. So use something. You've got to use something. Don't try to memorize stuff. It's just dangerous.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Utilize those guides, become familiar with norms you know, for different ages. I think the big thing to sum up this podcast is going back to doing the simple things, is establishing that IV and giving volume. That ultimately was what caused the seizure to break, was just simply giving normal saline.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, just looking at as many charts as I've looked at, I think, and I've been guilty of it, you know, I don't think we're aggressive enough with fluid resuscitation in our pediatric patients.
Yeah.
You know, kids are very healthy. They shouldn't just decompensate and start seizing or go unresponsive or have severe respiratory distress.
Yeah.
And so we have to always start with the simple things: manage that airway, give volume, check a blood sugar, and, you know, and then go from there.
Yeah. In this particular case, the way the patient progressed really kind of goes, it doesn't really jive with what we know about peds, and that is they tend to kind of just go and go and go. And she was fine. There was no outward signs of any issues. And then she just suddenly fell off the cliff, so to speak. So yeah, I think you're right. Managing those your initial assessments, your airway, your O2, your, you know, all those, just those first basic ALS things, and handling it that way. I think that's a great way to start.
So that, I think, is a great summary of that podcast. You know, again, pediatrics, that is a high stress call for many providers. And, you know, if you're wanting a great case based podcast, you know, that was one of our nightmare series cases.
Yeah.
Then check that one out.
Awesome. All right. The next one we're going to talk about was traumatic brain injury. So this was Understanding Current Therapies, Part 2. That's the name of the podcast. And this one had 8,350 downloads. And I guess the big takeaway, and I stress this we just had an airway lecture. We had the Fire Academy just start 2 weeks ago, and we did an airway day Monday. What is today? Wednesday. So yeah, it was Monday. Spent about 7.5, 8 hours with our old buddy Jeff Beer, who offered to come in and give our recruits some airway training. And we talked a lot about the 3 H's, and that was a big thing, and how those are just can be devastating as far as survival for your patient. So I guess that was kind of the major talk of that podcast, was not becoming hypotensive, not hypoventilating people. So talk a little bit about the podcast for us.
Yeah, so we did a 2-part podcast. This was part 2, and this was really focused on looking at the different types of head bleeds. And so remember, we have, just to kind of recap, we have an epidural bleed. The epidural bleeds are primarily an impact to it's called the pterion region. That's the region right above the temple. That's where the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes kind of intersect. And right underneath there, always think of the acronym MMA as an MMA fighter. So middle meningeal artery.
Yep.
And so that's kind of a great way to teach that, is you have that middle meningeal artery that lies right underneath that region, and just any type of doesn't have to be that big of an impact to that area. It can cause an epidural bleed. We know epidural bleeds are highly survivable. You just need to get them to that, the definitive neurosurgeon to drain that blood off.
Yep.
Then we have subdural. We talked about subarachnoid, and we talked about interventricular or parenchymal hemorrhages. And so remember, subarachnoid, we want to get that blood pressure down to 140 systolic. It's not about bringing it down slowly. If their blood pressure is 220 over 140, you bring it down to 140 systolic. And remember, subarachnoid hemorrhages are usually based on what's called a bearing aneurysm. Based on the circle of Willis, there's a small artery that comes off called the anterior communicating artery, and it's usually based on a hypertensive issue. So somebody's hypertensive, they have that sudden onset, blows it out, and that's a really weak, all those little vessels coming off of that circle of Willis come off at a 90-degree angle, and that's a weak area. And so we know we want to bring that down to 140 systolic, because the whole incidence of rebleeding is very high based on, again, those weak vessels. Those are high susceptibility to burst or cause rebleeding. And then we talked about the interventricular hemorrhages, and that our blood pressure goal there is a little higher, 160 systolic. So anything interventricular intracerebral, or you may see on a CT scan at, say, parenchymal hemorrhage. Those are going to be 160 systolic. And I think the big thing, as you said, Mike, is we have a primary traumatic brain injury. That's the insult. The secondary traumatic brain injuries, that's something that we cause, or we don't provide the care appropriately, or maybe we are responding and these, patients become hypoxic or hypotensive. And so we never want a hypotensive patient, and we never want a hypoxic patient.
Yeah.
And so we want to maintain a cerebral perfusion pressure for an adult of 70 millimeters of mercury, 60 for pediatrics. And when we get into the 50 range, that's where we start getting into the infarction, where we start having brain death. Yeah. And so there's something called HHH therapy. And this is honestly something that I just recently learned from my mentor, my boss actually, is Alan Wolf. And it's not too often that I'm listening in a class and something is talked about that I haven't heard. Yeah. So I perked up. Yeah. I was like, what? And so it just shows that we all have a lot to learn. Absolutely. There's so many things we can learn.
Yep.
And so this is something I think is very cool. And no matter what type of patient you have, this kind of throws a wrench into things when we think about trauma patients and permissive hypotension. So if you have a trauma patient and then you have a trauma patient that is also a traumatic brain injury patient, we've got to maintain a cerebral perfusion pressure of 70. So that is basically our map that we utilize for that formula is 15 to 20. We know that our patients are higher than that because 15 to 20 is normal. And so that means that our map has to be 85 to 90 minimum. So if your patient's ICP, and this HHH therapy is more for the transfer patient. If you're transferring a patient, they actually give you an ICP. They say the ICP is 40.
This, right. You get a number,
let's say it's 40. Well, if it's MAP minus ICP, and we have to maintain a cerebral perfusion pressure of 70, that means your MAP for that patient's got to be 110. And so you achieve that by utilizing this concept, HHH therapy. That means that you make them hypervolemic. Give them lots and lots and lots of volume. You make them hyperdynamic. You give them an inotrope medication like dobutamine to cause that heart to be hyperdynamic. And then you make them hypertensive, and you give them Levophed. And so no matter what you do, you constantly make sure that map is high enough to perfuse the brain and utilize that cerebral perfusion pressure of 70.
Yeah, and I hate to even mention it because I can't tell you what paper it was, but again, I want to say this just came from NAEMSP, but I could be wrong, and so I apologize. So this is just gonna be anecdotal, but I literally just read a paper that talked about the survivability of people with TBI, and that patients with a higher blood pressure have a lower mortality, and so that tends to be not super. That tends to be that doesn't make sense to some people, but the fact is that people with these higher blood pressures, when they arrive at whatever hospital, so let's just say it's our final destination for our patient, whatever is the higher level of care, that those patients that arrive with that higher blood pressure, and this is a testament to that, they tend to die less often and come out a little bit more functional. So really good stuff. Good stuff on that.
Yeah, no. And so I think, traumatic brain injuries, those are really the number one patients that we transport. And think about it. I mean, we don't have a functioning brain. There's no way you're going to live, right. and who would want to not live? So we got to really make sure that we're understanding that traumatic brain injury patients are very, they can be very straightforward, but we can't get mixed up and think that we just have a standard trauma patient that's hemorrhaging with an associated traumatic brain injury and think, oh, we're going to do permissive hypotension. We've got to, that kind of goes out the window. There's that fine line there where you got to, get that map up to that 85 to 90. And I think that's a great goal in a trauma patient that is also suffering from a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah. Awesome. Good stuff. So the next episode we're going to talk about is the changing airway management. And that was talking about the Heaven criteria, which is a little bit newer. I know the recruit class I talked to, we've got, let's see, 5 paramedics, 2 EMTs, and none of them had heard it. And so why don't you talk a little bit about Dave Olvera, who was a guest on here, and actually Dr. Dan Davis, and a little bit about the Heaven criteria, and what are we talking about with that?
So the Heaven criteria is a concept that Dr. Dan Davis and Dave Olvera, came up with. And when you look at the different research out there, and there's a few papers that we could put in the show notes, and I've put them in previous podcast show notes. When you look at predicting difficulty, doing your airway assessment, and one of the podcasts we did that really focused on this was called Damage Control RSI. Mm-hmm. And it was a very popular podcast as well, and had a lot of downloads. And I really hit on all the preparation that we do. That's the key thing. That really, when you look at the 7 Ps of RSI, and I added an 8th one in there of positioning, always making sure that head of bed of elevated 30 degrees. But really looking and predicting difficulty is we've got all these different acronyms. Yeah. And based on the published papers, it didn't really honestly predict difficulty. So when you look at the Heaven criteria, the Heaven criteria is based on predicting and looking at the resuscitation aspect prior to RSI. So focusing on resuscitation, looking, is my patient hypoxic? Do I have a patient that is going to be difficult to manage based on size, or having a no neck, or again, that goes back to positioning the patient with their head elevated, or maybe padding underneath their shoulders. Do I have an obstruction? Do I have a patient that has a tumor, or do they have a Le Fort's 3 fracture? Do they have something that's going to impede me from managing this airway?
Right. So they're anatomy. There's an anatomy.
Sure. Vomit. We know that most places nowadays we have all gone, I shouldn't say everybody, but the majority have gone to a video laryngoscope. Mm-hmm. Whether you're using the GlideScope or the CMAC or the McGrath, whatever you're using, it really brings other dynamics into play where you have to manage that airway as far as secretions more aggressively. And I think that's a good thing, because when we think about ventilator-associated pneumonia and the prevalence of that, and we as EMS providers or hospital staff, nurses and doctors, we're the cause of VAP, of not managing those secretions appropriately. And I think having the video laryngoscope aspect and applying that now, we know that we utilize training such as a SALA trainer, right? Yep. And the SALA trainer is a phenomenal tool to really train us to manage those secretions. So we don't want secretions in the airway. We want to always suction prior to ever putting a laryngoscope blade in the mouth. Yep. And so the V in the Heaven criteria is just that, is vomit. Yep. And then, is our patient exsanguinating? Are they bleeding out? Mm-hmm. And again, that goes back to resuscitation. And we see a lot of patients all over the world that arrest shortly after RSI.
Yep. They're peri-arrest before we do anything to them. And so typically, there's a lot of things that go into it. So our medication choices, that can send them over the edge. They're typically sicker people too, obviously.
Yeah, and I think we really got to push. We got to slow down. And I say this over and over. I say this when I teach, in other settings, that you have to slow down. And I think we're always so focused in on airway. But if you think about, we don't do ABCs anymore, do we? We do circulation first. Yeah. We always look at circulation. Well, we got to focus on that. We've got to optimize the blood pressure, manage the patient with passive oxygenation for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, manage them with a BVM if need be, get that SpO2 greater than 93%. And while you're doing that, give volume, give your blood, give your FFP if that's what you're carrying, start resuscitating the patients, and then make your selection based on the medications that's going to optimize that. And we know that in a low shock state, ketamine is kind of the go-to medication for RSI over etomidate or Versed. Mm-hmm. And so I think the Heaven criteria is a phenomenal tool. You utilize the Heaven criteria for purposes of again, looking at the resuscitation prior to intubation. And then you use the Lemons kind of mnemonic for the overall intubation process. And so I think, that podcast was very popular. I think Dave has done a phenomenal job in our industry, being a paramedic. And, he's presented published articles, he's published stuff and presented at the World Airway Conference in Ireland.
Yeah.
And so he's done a lot for our industry, and just want to commend him and say how proud of him I am at what he's done and his work in this area.
Awesome. Yeah. So that podcast had just about 8,200 downloads. So pretty phenomenal stuff. So good props to you, Dave. I'm sure you'll be listening. And let's move on to our next podcast. And this was the oxyhemoglobin curve, a resuscitation paradigm. So again, back to my initial hypothesis about why this was a popular download, is this tends to be a topic that people struggle with, especially folks that maybe are getting ready to test for their FPC or CFRN, or it could be just one of those things that's related to ventilator management. I mean, there's a bajillion different reasons why I think this one was popular. So why don't you talk maybe just a little bit about the highlights of that episode and kind of what your takeaways were about it?
Well, we know that, if you've heard the podcast, if you've come to the review course, this is one of my favorite subjects, and it kind of allows me to, have the nerd come out a little bit.
I was going to say,
I'm really
he nerds out pretty good with that.
Really fascinated by this concept, and I think the key take home points is we have what's called a right shift and a left shift, and it's all about hemoglobin's binding affinity. How well is oxygen going to bind with hemoglobin? Is it going to bind normally and release its loads to be dissolved in the plasma or be released, in the bloodstream, or is it going to hold on to your oxygen stores? And we know that the right shift on the hemoglobin curve, we kind of relate that and think about that's happening in our muscles. That's an area where we have a very low oxygen state. We have a very high acid state, a lot of CO2. That's where our carbonic acid buffering system really comes into play. But we know we have a high temperature in that area. We know that our patients will, all of us sitting here right now listening to this, or us recording this, that's going on constantly. And so basically in that setting, we have a higher acid state. We have a situation where our loads of oxygen, instead of being on our hemoglobin, which 98% of all of our O2 stores are actually held on our hemoglobin, they're being unloaded and dissolved in our blood. So the solubility increases and we have more oxygen floating around in our blood. In contrast, in a left shift situation, we have a situation where we think about our lungs, where we have a high concentrations of oxygen and a low concentration of acid. And in that state, we have a phenomenon where the affinity for hemoglobin to oxygen is high. The hemoglobin does not want to release its stores of oxygen, so it holds on to them. And so we can kind of see this, and we can utilize this concept in our patients. And we think about if they're very, very acidotic, think about they're going to just, based on the acidity, have a low SpO2, right? Because if your hemoglobin is unloading its stores into the bloodstream, the amount of oxygen bound to hemoglobin is lower. And so the saturation is lower. So that's why I always talk about looking at SpO2 don't get focused on it. Let's just say that, right? Your SpO2 will sometimes lead you down the wrong road. And I think you got to look at globally what's going on. It doesn't reflect true oxygenation to the tissues. It just reflects your concentrations of oxygen actually bound to hemoglobin. And so, I encourage you to listen to that podcast. There's a lot more to it. Sure. And I think it's very interesting in how we apply our care to our patients.
Awesome. All right. And finally, our last episode that we're going to talk about, which was actually the third most popular, was number 3. So we didn't necessarily do these in order. But this was our second shift episode. There we had Dr. Ritu Sani on, and we talked about HR 4365. And so most of you, if you heard it, we released it both on the FlightBridgeED side and the second shift side. And that podcast had about 8,320 downloads. And that was the episode where we talked about the DEA rules that apply to EMS and the fact that there aren't any, and the fact that there wasn't any. There was going to be rules dropped on all EMS, medical directors, providers, that essentially would put us in line with the Controlled Substance Act of about like 1972. And so that just wasn't going to work for us. And so there was a lot of advocacy, and this was really our first big jump into advocacy. So in other words, going to our elected officials and telling them why this is a bad idea. And so NAEMSP, NAEMT, so every acronymed members, professional membership, group out there was in full support of trying to make sure this didn't happen. So what they did was they brought forward a bill to the House of Representatives, and it was called, I think the actual name for it, I want to pull it up because I don't want to say it wrong, but it was Protecting Patient Access to Emergency Medications Act of 2016 is what the actual bill was called. And it was introduced by Representative, I think it's Bill Hudson, and he was, Richard Hudson out of North Carolina, not Bill. I don't know where I got that. Maybe it's because I was talking about a bill or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, Richard Hudson, he introduced that in 2016, and it was kind of late summer-ish, as I recall, when that got introduced. And there wasn't a lot of hope that we were actually going to be able to get this bill passed before the end of the year. But amazingly, we were actually able to get it out of the House of Representatives and onto the Senate in just a few months. And it was an amazing thing. And people that listened to the podcast were writing and calling their elected officials, their senators, representatives. And we were really making a huge push for this to go through. And so we had Dr. Sani, who was representing NAEMSP. He was on the podcast. He kind of gave us the entire background of kind of where we were as far as DEA rules, especially the ones that people think applied to EMS, but they really didn't. There's nothing in the Controlled Substance Act about EMS, and essentially what it was going to mean if the DEA were to go ahead and enact kind of their version of what they thought we should be doing. And so what it was going to mean to the provider, so you and me, was that we weren't going to be able to administer controlled drugs without a patient-specific prescription. So in other words, there's no more protocols for things like fentanyl, Versed, ketamine, whatever it may be. We weren't going to be able to give it unless we called in and talked to a physician at a hospital that would give us a patient-specific prescription to give to that patient. And you might think, well, I mean, that's, maybe that doesn't seem like such a bad thing. And maybe that's true where you live. But remember, there's a lot of places where there is very limited communications between the field and the hospital. So that is, maybe there's no cell service. Maybe the radios don't reach. There's a lot of issues with that. So their NAEMSP and all the groups got together. They presented this bill. Like I said, Representative Hudson introduced it. It passed the House, but it did not make it through the Senate in 2016. So essentially, it was like not all hope was lost, but it did not pass. And so basically what you have to do is you have to start the entire process over again the next year. So I think it was January 3rd so just a month ago, that Representative Hudson reintroduced it on the 3rd, and it actually made it through the House in about 6 days and passed and has been turned over to the Senate now. There's been a roll call vote on it. So things are looking very good. So we're going to get this bill passed. There's no doubt in my mind, even with all the other drama that's going on in the United States political system right now. I think our Protecting Patient Access to Emergency Medications bill is going to pass and will become law, and it's going to be super phenomenal. So if you want the nitty-gritty details about that, that's kind of an update of where we are today. But if you want to go back and listen to that episode, it was super eye-opening. and it was something that was going to affect every single provider in the United States. So I would suggest you go back, listen to that, and then keep an eye on this, because we're still going to need support from providers to get a hold of their senators and let them know that, you expect them to support this bill and what it means to you as a provider. So there's lots of information. And again, if you go back and listen to the podcast, Dr. Sani will talk about where you can find advocacy information, how to email your senators and how to call them, and how important it is to actually build a relationship with your elected officials when it comes to times like this. Because again, we're going to have people making decisions for EMS that have no idea what we do. They have no clue. And unless we tell them, it's not important to them. So that was kind of the gist of that episode. And again, just about 8,400 downloads. It was pretty awesome. And we tried to get Dr. Sani on today. Unfortunately, our schedules, again, just didn't jive up, and he was traveling to Indianapolis or something like that. So it didn't work. So that essentially covers the top 5 most downloaded episodes since FlightBridgeED Podcast family kind of has gotten started. Any final thoughts or words, Eric?
No, I just want to thank everybody from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of my wife, that, we really appreciate all the support and all the emails. Keep them coming. Ideas for podcasts. If you need help with anything related to your career, or, just reach out, and I will always bend over backwards to try to do that. So it's been an amazing journey.
And here's to the next 100 episodes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we always close with is if you ever need to get a hold of Eric, super easy. His email is eric.bauer@flightbridgeed.com. If you want to get a hold of me, it's mike.verkest@flightbridgeed.com. And we always encourage everyone to go to the FlightBridgeED.com website, check it out, look for review courses, go to the podcast section, look at those show notes. You can find every one of those podcasts here. If you use something like iTunes, you can jump on there and subscribe to both the FlightBridgeED podcast as well as the Second Shift podcast. And again, just like Eric said, we appreciate all the support. We love the shout outs. Get on Twitter, get involved in social media, get involved with your elected officials, do all those things, and it'll do nothing but advance our practice in the field. And Eric, thank you for everything that you do. I love you, buddy. And I guess on behalf of Eric Bauer, this is Mike Verkest, and you've been listening to the 100th episode of the FlightBridgeED Podcast. Take care, everybody, and we will talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education. For more, visit FlightBridgeED.com.